with people. We saw people being taken out of the crowd who'd collapsed. Some had been crushed by all of the people here. Others had suffered from dehydration and the stress of the last few days. Many of these people who've been trying to get out of Libya for over a week now. And obviously once they pass this border post, this gate, and get into Tunisia, their situation is much better. There is still a large number waiting in Tunisia to get on a ship or on a plane out of here. But on the Tunisian side, they have the help of Tunisian aid agencies, also international organizations, the EU, the UN, UNHCR. They have set up a tented camp on this side of the border. So obviously that means the situation for the people once they cross the frontier is far better. And I think the emergency here is beginning to ease.
Now, the Arab League has signaled it could impose a no-fly zone over Libya, along with the African Union, to deal with the crisis in the country. But the U.S. has struck a more cautious note. Over now to Shihab Ratanzi in our Washington Broadcast Center for more. Shihab?
Thanks, Anand. Senior U.S. officials speaking on Capitol Hill on Wednesday reiterated the difficulties in implementing such a plan. Still, some U.S. lawmakers say a no-fly zone can and should be put in place. John Terrett reports from Capitol Hill.
Mr. Crenshaw is recognized.
Remarks from senior officials in the Obama administration reveal the challenges faced when dealing with Libya. Hours before heavy hitters gave testimony on Capitol Hill, the U.S. Senate unanimously approved a non-binding resolution that calls on the UN to impose a no-fly zone over Libya, a popular idea with many in Washington.
Well, I think that everyone is worried about what's happening and wants to put an end to it. No one wants to let this go on.
But with increasing concerns being voiced from UN and NATO members, administration officials are pointing out how difficult it would be to establish a no-fly zone over Libya.
And let's just call a spade a spade. A no-fly zone begins with an attack on Libya to destroy the air defenses. That's the way you do a no-fly zone.
Secretary of State Hillary Clinton said the administration's worried Libya could become a giant Somalia, and she drew parallels between a potential no-fly zone for Libya and circumstances in the Balkans 2 decades ago.
The difficulty of it, the maintenance of it, the appearance of it, and eventually it was determined that it was in the interests of the peace and stability of the region, etc.
At Wednesday's White House briefing, Libya was third on the agenda behind the shootings of U.S. service personnel in Germany and domestic budget issues.
The no-fly zone is an option that is being actively considered. It is, as are other options.
Even though the Arab League and the African Union are now talking about imposing a no-fly zone over Libya themselves, the international community remains divided on the effectiveness of such an approach. Nations like Russia, France and China, with veto-wielding powers in the Security Council, are fearful that a no-fly zone may lead to a protracted conflict, like the ones in Iraq and Afghanistan. In other words, while countries within NATO, the UN and the EU are keen to see Gaddafi's planes grounded to prevent attacks on civilians, they don't want to risk putting more foreign military boots on the ground in a region already perceived to have enough already. John Terrett, Al Jazeera, Washington.
The UN Security Council has not authorized any military action in Libya, as the US Defense Secretary has been at pains to point out. Ibrahim Dabashi, though, is Libya's deputy ambassador at the United Nations, and he's publicly denounced the Gaddafi regime. Earlier, my colleague Imran Gardis spoke with him by phone from New York, and he explained why, in his opinion, the UN might end up backing a no-fly zone after all.
No, I don't agree that to impose a no-fly zone that it is to destroy. Certainly maybe to destroy a limited air defense, but if this will be the pretext to destroy many places in Libya, certainly no one will accept it, especially if civilian victims will fall. But I think even with the threat that any plane, if it flies over in the space of Libya, will be shot down, this might be enough to impose a no-fly zone. I don't think that it is necessary to destroy all air defense before before imposing this, because I think a threat sometimes is enough, and also with the capability of suspicion in the Mediterranean, certainly they can shoot down any plane which fly on the space of Libya, especially if this is a helicopter or something like that.
Amro Musa, I'm sorry, sir, Mr. Dabashi. Amro Musa from the Arab League has suggested that the Arab League and the African Union could impose their own no-fly zone over Libya without getting the involvement of the United Nations, without getting the involvement of the United States or NATO. Isn't that a far better option?
I think maybe the Arab League, they have the capability to do it. I am not sure about that. But anyway, I don't think the African Union has any capability at all to impose a no-fly zone over Libya. But anyway, maybe it is the League of Arab States needs the moral support of the African Union, so that anyway, any kind of coordination to impose this, if the capabilities are there, it is welcome.
Ibrahim Dabashi speaking to Imran Garda. Well, I spoke earlier to Henry Schuler. He's a retired U.S. diplomat who once served in Benghazi, the town in eastern Libya in control of anti-government protesters now. I asked him whether perhaps part of the international community's strategy was to keep talking about a no-fly zone, simply to keep the pressure up on the Libyan regime, even if members of the international community actually were utterly reluctant to get involved.
Well, that may very well be the case, but it is a difficult challenge. If we only had to establish a no-fly zone over eastern Libya, which has been liberated on the ground, we don't need to worry about surface-to-air missile defense. But if we're going to deploy over, establish a no-fly zone over the western cities, that's a very different situation, and I'm certainly not going to challenge the Secretary of Defense in that regard. I haven't deployed with the aircraft carrying the Sixth Fleet since 1958.
But you do think the U.S. can supply some assistance?
Oh, yes. There's no doubt whatsoever that we can apply, and I think probably the first thing, the most important thing, would be to disrupt the command and communication system of control of the Gaddafi forces, and perhaps shut down the propaganda machine at the same time. And I spoke to a former U.S. Secretary of Defense as recently as yesterday, who confirmed that that is no difficult task.
But do you think there's such suspicion of U.S. motivation that even such covert activity will be almost seen as even worse, and an even more underhand manner that the U.S. will be trying to get hold of Libya's oil? I mean, that's the problem, isn't it? There's such suspicion of the U.S. in the region and elsewhere.
Well, I think as long as we avoid boots on the ground, that's much diminished. It is a concern that's what is driving us. It's not. I think it's a very sincere effort to support the brave Libyan effort to overthrow Gaddafi.
I mean, along with your diplomatic duties, you were actually also in charge of an oil company just before the Gaddafi took over.
I was in Tripoli at the time he seized power.
How do you think the oil companies are looking at this? What are they thinking about, and what are they saying to the U.S. government about their